Hey, we're here today to talk about hydration and fueling specific to Ultra Trail Australia, which is in the backyard here. And we're with Darryl from KODA Nutrition, who is a partner of the race. Today I'm very passionate about helping athletes nail their hydration and nutrition for race day. So we're going to go through some really important things for UTA runners of all levels to know so that they can maximise their experience and performance on the day. So Darryl, I think the first thing we want to talk about is hydration.
Yes, and it's very important for this particular race, particularly if you're out there for a long time. And anything to do with hydration or nutrition or fueling, the longer you're out there, the more important it becomes.
Yeah.
Because we're limited by what our stomach can process. And for these sort of events, we're always going to lose more than our stomach can process. So it's about understanding what you're losing, how much you're losing, and then how much your stomach can tolerate at elevated heart rate.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of varying conditions and circumstances that would make that unique to everybody and even unique to this race. We were discussing before off camera the fact that Ultra Trail Australia starts often in 4 or 5 degree temperature and can reach up to mid-20s down in the Megalong Valley later in the race. So you've often got a 20 degree variable in this course, which is quite a unique thing to have, especially in an ultra, that creates some unique challenges for athletes to have to manage. So, what advice can you give to runners about responding to that difference and how their bodies will perform differently in those different temperatures?
Yeah, for sure. And you're right with variables. It's not just the temperature that you're going to experience over those from cold to warm to cold again. It's also the amount that the athlete loses as well in regards to how much sweat or the volume of sweat they lose.
Yeah.
Everyone will lose different amounts. So they need to drink different amounts. The amount of sodium they lose in their sweat varies massively between individuals. So that needs to be something that needs to be addressed as well. So it's not just do this one thing and it's going to work for everyone, because as you mentioned, with the colder conditions, if you're not sweating much, you don't need to drink much. And a big problem with a lot of athletes at this particular event, when it is cold in the morning, is that they feel they need to be drinking a lot all the time. Now, if it's cold and you're not sweating much, you don't need to drink much. As it starts to warm up and the day starts to increase in temperature and you start to sweat more, then you start to increase the volume of fluid.
Right.
So adjusting the amount you drink is going to be very important, because if you're drinking too much, you're just going to compromise the stomach. And whether that's just really severe cramping, which affects how fast you can run or how fast you can move along the trail, but also could be vomiting or diarrhea and all those sorts of things, which you want to try as hard as you can to avoid.
Absolutely.
The stomach is the single most important organ in the body during these endurance events. You compromise the stomach, you're just going to slow down. So that understanding that the amount of fluid that you drink is going to change based on the weather conditions that you're experiencing at the time. So the biggest point there is, don't lock yourself into a set volume of fluid every single hour, because it's going to be at some point too much and other times not enough.
Yes.
So that's something that's really important for this sort of event.
So I guess not having that cookie cutter approach where you read the chart and it says you should drink this much fluid this often, but instead having a bit more of a responsiveness to the conditions is what you're saying as well.
Yeah.
And understanding the role that the salt in your sweat plays in that as well. So would you recommend people run with plain water, or obviously we're losing salt, so how would you manage the salt? Yeah,
well, on that point about how much you need to drink, it's based on how much you're losing at the time. So what I would suggest is that when the runners are going out to do a run, is that they do pre and post weight. So they get an understanding of how much sweat they're losing in different temperatures. That way, when they get to race day, they're not guessing about how much they need to drink.
Yeah, and we did that this morning. So myself and Scott went out for a run, and we did the exact same run and measured our sweat loss, and
Yeah.
Scott lost nearly 2 kilos of sweat and I lost 200 mils.
Yes.
So it's very telling to show what unique bodies we have, and how if we don't understand these things about ourselves,
Absolutely.
you know, we can suffer in a race and seemingly not know why.
That's right. So, you know, in that scenario, your sweat rate or the volume of sweat you lost was very low. Where Scott it was higher, but still I've seen a lot higher in those sort of conditions. It was 1.8 litres for the hour. Yours was 200 mils or 0.2. If you were drinking the same volumes of fluid, if you were locked into the same volume, you're obviously going to get way too much and you're going to compromise the stomach. Whereas Scott needs to drink an amount where he's not going to replace all he loses. It's impossible to consume that much while you're running. So he would aim for probably around about 750 mils an hour.
Okay.
Because the stomach is even more compromised when you're running. It's like a washing machine. So the amounts you could drink if you were cycling or something like that is a lot greater. With running, you need to be really mindful that it's a little bit more limited.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you need to find out what that volume is that you can comfortably tolerate each hour.
Yes.
And so then you mentioned the sodium concentration as well, which ranges massively between individuals. So some are going to need a lot more sodium than others, and some are going to need it way more than others.
Yes.
So having that understanding as well, when you're addressing your needs during these type of events, particularly over multiple hours, the better you can address your needs each hour, the better that you're going to get to, or the more likely you're going to get to the finish, running the pace you want to run without having the issues that are quite common with these type of endurance events.
Yeah, that was really fascinating this morning to understand, I guess, the volume of salt that's in my sweat as well, and knowing that was quite high, like cramping and I guess those issues for me do occur in really hot races, and now to understand why that is the case, and also chatting to you about how much salt I've been intaking in my races, especially the ones where I've come unstuck, and understanding that I'm well below what I need to be has been a bit of a game changer and quite enlightening to me. Like, I was really surprised by that, and I imagine that there's a lot of runners out there who are taking in way too little salt. Would you agree with what you see and who you speak to? Yeah,
I've done over 1,500 tests measuring the sodium concentration of athletes' sweat, and it's the reason why I've developed a tablet that has no sugar. There's no calories.
Yeah.
So in some cases, an athlete might take just one tablet in a flask or a bottle, whereas some athletes might use 2 or 3. So that way you can address your needs.
Okay.
There's going to be times where some athletes will just tolerate the conditions much better than others, and it's simply because they're not losing as much and they can manage their losses better. So when there's an athlete at the side of the trail, might be cramping or something like that, it's a very good indication that they haven't been getting enough sodium.
Okay.
And the amount of times that we've been able to solve cramping issues has been that sodium component. They're thinking, oh well, I'm getting enough, and I don't know why this is still happening, but when you do the test and you see how much they're losing, they immediately recognise that, okay, I see where I've been, maybe not addressing my needs as well as I could, where, in different conditions, in cooler conditions, they're not experiencing those, and they're thinking, okay, I've nailed it now. But if it's 15 degrees warmer, where their sweat rate increases and the cumulative amount of sodium they are losing increases, they're getting those troubles, and they go, okay, so what's different? I've done exactly the same. Why am I experiencing these issues again?
Yeah, so, bringing it back to that responsiveness, right?
Yeah. As the temperature changes, your needs change from a hydration perspective.
Yes, and I do remember before I understood this about my sweat and doing the sweat testing, I do remember you giving me the quick fix of if I started to cramp, to put some shots tablet just directly under my tongue, and how effective I've seen that work, where I've had the early stages of twitching and cramps in a race, and I've managed it by just trying to get some sodium into me quicker than drinking by putting it under my tongue and just leaving it there to let it dissolve. And I've noticed that my cramps have just backed right off and gone away. And maybe I've had to repeat that throughout the race, but doing the sweat testing today and talking about this in depth a little bit more has made me understand the science behind why that works, and that makes it really helpful to, when you can understand why you're doing something, it's much easier to do it when you're out there in the race.
Yeah, when you've got those numbers to look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what is highlighted in the past is that probably you haven't been getting enough sodium, so you've been going for that quick fix. So if you're addressing your needs properly, you're less likely to even get those twinges.
So putting more in the water to start with.
And then you're not looking for that quick fix. If you're addressing your needs properly, you should be able to maintain that pace that you want to run at, and not have the issues that are going to slow you down, because that's the whole thing. You want to get through this and enjoy it as much as possible. It's the enjoyment of recognising the time that you've set and not at the side of the trail vomiting or cramping and all these things that slow you down that are so frustrating. So if you can address those things and have a good understanding of what you need before you even get to the event, and a good time to start right now. When you've got a lot of time to work on, and especially if you're going to experience those mid-20s that you can along the Megalong section there, if it is extraordinarily warm, and it can get warm in May, then you want to know what your losses are so you can address them at that point.
Absolutely.
Because if you're not, it's going to show up later on, and that last 20 or 30 Ks are going to be a lot harder than they have to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about fueling in a second, but just in terms of when things do become hard because you've made a mistake with your hydration, say you do get yourself into that situation where you're cramping and your gut's gone funny because you've either had too much or not enough fluid. I think, working with UTA for many years now and having run it myself, you do see a lot of people who withdraw from the race who potentially did so because they didn't know how to manage a situation like that in their body and continue on. So do you have any advice for runners who've maybe made these mistakes with their hydration, and how, especially within an ultra, they could adapt and get through that?
Yeah, well, a lot of the time, it might be 5 or 6 or 7 hours into a race, and that's when the issues might, pop up, whether it's stomach issues or cramping or whatever it might be. And a lot of the time, they're under the impression that it's something they've just taken. But most likely, it's something that they've done over those hours prior that lead up to that point. So
I can relate to that. You always blame the last thing.
You're blaming the last thing you've taken. So whether it's a gel or a bar or whatever it might be, you're like, damn, why did I take that for? Well, it was unlikely it was just that one thing. It was what you've done prior to that. Whether it was too much of something or not enough of something. But if you are experiencing any issues, it's really just managing that and say, okay, can I still walk? Can I still keep moving? Because it's so painful that I just have to stop for a few minutes, let it just relax. From a stomach, it's just a matter of just letting it clear. And that could be just a slow walk, where you might just stop for a few minutes and go, okay, I'm ready to go. Or just start slowly, and I'll slowly ease into it. Now, what haven't I been addressing? What have I been doing wrong here that's caused this? What do I need to change? Because you can make some changes. So it might be that you get to an aid station. It might be that you need something savoury because you're sick of something sweet. It might be just something. And so just, even it takes half an hour to clear or 45 minutes, whatever it might be, it's much better that you lose 45 minutes than not finish something that you've started. So from a cramping perspective, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be that you've drunk way too much plain water and you've diluted the sodium concentrations of your blood.
Yes.
And you haven't addressed your needs properly. So that way it might be at a station where you can get extra sodium into you, make sure that you increase that. And it's amazing how quickly it reacts.
Yes.
It's almost instantaneous that you'll get a good response from increasing amount of sodium.
Okay.
Very rarely is it that you've had too much, because it's a mineral that we have a real battle trying to replace the amount we lose, and some athletes have a much harder time trying to replace how much they lose.
Yeah, that's I think that's really important for people to understand, because I even know myself, you can feel pretty sick when your gut goes, and it's pretty hard to imagine that in just half an hour or 45 minutes you can be okay and ready to go again. So I think it's good to understand that if you take that time, and obviously being aware that if you do need to stop, trying to walk slowly to an aid station where you can stay warm, especially in UTA if you're doing it at night, is a sensible thing to do. So managing things around that, but taking that time and just trusting that your gut is something that can be managed. It's not a deal breaker, and you just have to keep being intuitive and responsive. So can you give some people some insight into nutrition, how often they should have it, what kind of fuel and why, and how they learn the unique environment of their own body and manage their nutrition to suit that? Yeah,
that's a good point, because we're all different and we all use different amounts of fuel. And from a nutritional fueling perspective, it's about food. We eat food for energy. So the type of foods that you eat when you're running need to be very different than what we normally eat during the day, because we're at elevated heart rate, and our stomach is a lot more vulnerable when we're running, logistically, because it's like a washing machine. So understanding that you're not going to ever replace what you lose, but firstly, with fueling for an event of this duration, we need to know our calorie expenditure, or how many calories we're expending each hour. And a calorie is just a unit of energy. So how many units of energy are we expending running at a certain speed? It's not based on how much you weigh, it's based on how fast you're running.
Okay.
So there's a lot about, if I weigh this much, this is how much I need. Well, if someone who's 60 kilo is running 14 hours, and someone who's 60 kilo is running 20 hours, they're not going to need the same amount of fuel. The runner who's running for 14 hours is going to need a lot more fuel each hour than the athlete that's running for 20 hours.
Yes, so
simply because it's because it's nothing to do with how much they weigh. It's the intensity that they're running at. Exactly. So the first thing you have to do is you need to go, right, I'm running 100 kilometers and I want to run it in 20 hours. That's my goal. I'm going to be really happy if I can do 20 or under 20 hours. So to run 20 hours, 100 kilometres, you've got to average 5 kilometres an hour, which doesn't sound like it's super fast, but over 20 hours, it's a fair pace.
It's a lot of stairs.
It is a lot of stairs, a lot of climbing. You've got to take that into consideration. There's a lot of elevation over this event. So at 5 kilometres an hour, how many calories am I expending? Now this is where your heart rate monitor comes into it, because that's your fuel gauge. That's telling us how much fuel or how many units of energy we're expending each hour.
Okay.
So that's your calorie expenditure. So at 5 kilometres an hour, your average heart rate might be 120 to 130, and you're burning, let's say hypothetically, 400 calories an hour. So you go, okay, I know my fuel now. I know that I'm expending 400 calories an hour. Now, the key is to work out then over 20 hours, multiply that 400 by 20, that's 8,000 calories that you're expending over those 20 hours, which is a massive amount of calories.
It's a lot, absolutely.
It's about 3 days worth of food for a normal person.
Wow.
So now we have an understanding of what we're going to be losing or expending each hour. So what we need to work out now in our training is what can my stomach comfortably tolerate if I'm expending 400 calories?
Because it's not going to be 3 days worth of food, that's
for
sure.
No, exactly. There's always going to be a gap between your calorie expenditure and how much your stomach's able to consume or process. So let's say, hypothetically, it's 150 to 200 calories.
Yeah.
And you're sort of aiming for that range. Once again, you're not replacing all that you lose, but you're minimising that percentage of loss.
Sure.
And that's the best you can do. You can't do any better than that.
Yeah.
We want to consume an amount that's going to keep us active and being able to keep those legs moving at that pace, but not too much that it's going to compromise the stomach and we end up on the side of the trail,
Sick.
buckled over. And as soon as you get those stomach issues, it changes your gait, it changes the positioning, your body positioning, everything, and it slows you down.
And importantly, it changes the psychology, your headspace.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to be comfortable. It's got to be, it's going to be hard and it's going to be a challenge, absolutely. But it's still got to be enjoyable.
Absolutely.
And vomiting and diarrhea and stomach issues and cramping, it's not enjoyable.
No.
So we need to do as much as we
confirm.
can.
Yeah.
We need to do as many things as we can in preparation to avoid those things. And we want to get as many people across that finish line as possible.
Okay, so in terms of our runners, we've got a lot who are new.
Yeah.
So very simply, how do they figure out what they need?
Yeah, so that simply is they need to know...
Their heart rate.
Well, yeah, so then firstly, what time they want to run. 20 hours, 15 hours, 12, 13, whatever it might be. At 15 hours, 7.5 kilometres an hour they need to average. So obviously their calorie expenditure is going to be a bit more than that person who's running at 20. So they might be looking at 200 to 220 calories an hour. So it's having that understanding first of what your calorie expenditure is and using that heart rate monitor and seeing, right, and a lot of people use their heart rate monitor, they look at their heart rate zone and all that sort of stuff, but now it's a fuel gauge. They know what or how many units of energy they're expending each hour.
And the watches will often tell you that as well, won't they? Now
Yeah,
they'll tell you burnt this many calories.
It'll tell you, so if you go out for a 4-hour run and you've burnt 1,600 calories, you know that that's 400 calories an hour.
And that's your starting point. And then you take that into training and you start to expect, because I know personally, I did this the hard way. I didn't use this science and I regret that. But I have figured out, I think pretty much figured out my fueling now off the back of a lot of years of trial and error. And for me, in an ultra, I tend to take 110 calories every 40 minutes or so. I think I benefit from having a little bit more, but I have a really sensitive stomach. I've never been able to even take that much until I was using this product, which does seem to sit better with me. So the real game changer for me was using it in training and practicing in some of my, I guess, less important or less goal races and seeing how it went and then constantly calibrating that. So would you recommend that people be doing this in training and trying to dial in what works for them? Because there is the numbers to work off, but then there's probably things going on in our bodies that unless we try something, we won't know.
100%. And you're spot on. We will all have different numbers when it comes to our sweat rate, the sodium concentration in our sweat, how many calories we're expending. But then with our digestive system, there is hundreds of millions of neurons. Our digestive systems are so different. Some can tolerate more, less, different types of ingredients. So this is why it's really important to consume foods that meet that science as well, with the understanding that the stomach is super important. It's the single most important organ in the body when we're competing in an endurance event. So you're spot on. Practicing what works best for you, not what your best friend said, I'll do this because it works for me. It's what works for you, because there's 7 billion of us on the planet and every single one of us are different.
Yes.
None of us are alike.
So get your numbers, map out a plan, then go practice it and then calibrate it pursuant to the real life feedback that you get in your training. That's really good advice. I think the other really interesting thing for people to understand is that not all calories are equal in terms of what that calorie is. So what this product is and why you designed it to be what it is in terms of consistency and the kind of sugar you use. Understanding that your stomach, your gut is compromised when you're racing and you're nervous. So even before the race, you can be quite nervous, and so your stomach is not necessarily able to process or intake or digest things as it normally would. So you often see a lot of people come unstuck in races, and I've spoken to them and said, oh, well, what were you eating? And they're like, oh, I was having trail mix or nuts or, donuts or whatever. And I can look at that with what you've taught me and what I've learnt and understand why that may have not benefited them. So I think it would be really interesting to hear the science behind why this is the way it is.
Yeah. Well, the first thing when you say about practicing in training is make as many mistakes in training as possible.
Yes.
That's the number one point there. So because you don't want to make mistakes on the day.
Absolutely.
Because if you can lessen those mistakes, then you're going to have a much better day. It's going to be a lot more enjoyable. But yeah, so in regards to the actual product itself, so from a fueling perspective, what we do differently here is we separate your energy and your hydration. So we don't drink calories.
Yes.
Because drinking calories locks you into a set volume.
Yes.
And we talked about the different temperatures that you experience at UTA. You're going to have to be changing the volume of fluid that you drink based on how much you're losing, which is going to be different to everyone, but the environmental conditions. As the temperatures change, you adjust the volume of fluid you drink.
Yes.
So we don't compromise the stomach. So that's why we separate. Plus,
much simpler to manage too.
It's much simpler. And if you do have a higher sodium concentration in your sweat, if you feel like you get crusty, and the idea of that is with the electrolyte tablets is that you can add more tablets to address your own needs.
Yes.
You know, some runners might be 1 tablet, some might be 2, some might be 3 in a small bottle. But addressing your needs will allow you to realise your goal that you've set.
Absolutely.
So from the energy perspective, you've got a combination of gels and bars. Now, all of these products have been specifically designed to be gentle on the stomach.
Okay.
So this gel's next year will be 25 years old.
Wow.
So the whole idea about
that particular gel's 25 years old.
Yeah, yeah. This one's 25 years old. Yeah.
Gee, it's lasted well.
It has. The formulation is 25 years old. So the whole idea about understanding calories and what you're consuming, firstly, is the energy to volume ratio. And what that means is whatever amount of calories that you've decided is going to work best for you and what your stomach can tolerate is the amount of energy and the amount of volume that your stomach needs to tolerate. So in this regard, it's 33 mil volume and there's 117 calories. So basically what that means is that it's a large amount of calories, but in a small volume, less likely to upset the stomach.
Okay.
The second thing is thermic effect. And what that means is you want to be consuming a food that requires the least amount of energy and is not drawing blood away from the active muscles to the stomach. So in gel form, it's similar to chyme, which all food is converted to in the stomach through the digestive process. Now, in this liquid semi-fluid form, the stomach already recognises it. So it bypasses all those normal digestive system or digestive processes. So it has a very low thermic effect and enters the bloodstream very quickly as glucose, which the muscles muscles and brain, importantly for trail running, can access. And the third thing is low sensory impact. Now, at elevated heart rate, our senses are heightened. So anything that's mildly disturbing at resting heart rate is incredibly disturbing at elevated heart rate.
That's so true.
So it's got to be something that you can consume and not really have to think about too much. You know, just anything that slightly upsets you will be super annoying at elevated heart rate. So there's non-caffeinated and there's caffeinated options. Do you want to get into the caffeine option? Or?
Well, what I'd like to, I definitely, because, you know, having worked with a lot of runners myself, I've seen that both benefit and bring people unstuck. So I think it's a really cool thing to talk about. But one thing I wanted to quickly touch on in regards to the gels is the sugars.
Yeah.
So obviously glucose is the easiest thing to absorb when we're exercising.
Yeah.
We can take it in through membranes in our mouth, through the membranes in our stomach. Like it uptakes really quickly and easily. So in terms of the sugar that you use and why you've done that, I think that's interesting for people to understand.
Yeah, for sure. So there's no refined crystalline form sugars. So it's not heavily processed. Basically what it is it's a maltodextrin, but there's about 150 different grades of maltodextrin.
Wow.
So with this particular maltodextrin, it's a high-grade premium maltodextrin that has no refined crystalline form sugars.
Okay. Now,
as you come down that list, and the cheaper the maltodextrin, the more refined processed sugars are added to keep the price down. And that's where you have your crystalline form fructose and all that sort of thing, which can bring a lot of athletes unstuck.
And that makes sense, because you do hear, and I've heard lots of people say that they can't do gels. Gels upset my stomach, gels irritate my gut, and I think it's important to highlight that not all sugars are equal, and thus not all gels are equal. So it's really important that people understand their labels, and if they've had trouble with gel in the past, it's not necessarily going to be the case.
Yeah, you're spot on. Not all gels are the same, exactly. So it comes down to being mindful of the demographic that you're providing a product to.
Sure.
And once again, being mindful that the stomach is the single most important organ in the body. Cardiovascularly and respiratory, you've worked on that. You can't do any more about that. You've conditioned yourself to run that pace you want to run. The stomach is something that you can upset very easily. And having that understanding that the foods that you put in, there's science behind it. And like I say, it's that energy to volume ratio, thermic effect, low sensory impact. And low sensory impact is it's less likely to upset the stomach. And having that understanding that it's a high premium maltodextrin, like it's a high fuel. A lot of athletes who have tried the gel, who have had problems with others, tolerate these just fine.
Yeah, and that's definitely been my experience as well. UTA is a race that attracts a huge spectrum of abilities, because it's a very well supported race. So we have lots of runners that are out there for 20 to 30 hours, some of them. So who I guess are at a pace that they are going to get hungry. So the front of the pack probably can run the whole race just on gels and maybe a bar, athlete food. But there's a lot of people out there who are going to come into the aid stations, and I think UTA's got some of the best aid stations you'd see. It's pretty much a buffet. But I think that's also a place where people can come unstuck if they make bad choices. And there's not necessarily bad food out there, but in terms of understanding what they're doing with their body. So are they going to go and hit a hard run section straight after that aid station? So what would you recommend people to consider when they're coming into an aid station? I mean, I'm asking this question because in my experience, I remember once I took a gel on the clock not long before I came into an aid station, and then came in and saw something really appealing, so I ate that, and then my crew had Coke, so I downed a cup of Coke as well, and I essentially over-caloried myself enormously and spent a good period of time after that trying to correct the problem and being that person on the side of the trail that you spoke about before. So do you have any advice for people about, just cautionary?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing, there's no right or wrong. It's about individual personal preference. But if you've set a certain amount of calories each hour, and importantly, those amount of calories don't change. It's going to be a set amount of calories each hour, whether it's 4 degrees or 24 degrees. The thing that will change is the amount of fluid that you drink. So that calorie it's consistent all the way through, because you're burning the same amount of calories, or should be, all the way through. In regards to what you should eat, you're spot on. Don't try and think, well, actually I missed the last aid station, or I haven't been eating well. Don't try and then overcompensate by eating too much, because it's just going to compromise the stomach, because it's already vulnerable. If you see something that you think, I feel like that, just try a small amount, but don't eat it all at once. Just grab it and then eat smaller amounts along the way. Just be mindful that the stomach is, once again, vulnerable. So just have smaller amounts, and don't just smash everything down trying to make up for maybe things you've missed prior. Smaller amounts, more often. Take that pressure off the stomach. And that's probably the best thing. In regards to what that is, whether it's some chips or a banana or a bit of cake, Danish or whatever it might be, don't try and down the whole thing.
Yes.
That's the biggest mistake.
Take your time with
Take
it.
smaller amounts along the way and just enjoy it
Yeah.
as you would normally.
And easing back into the run after it, I think, is a good piece of advice as well.
Yeah.
I know for me that after I've hit something a little bit heavier in some of the races where I've had to go slower and I want to get some food in, allowing yourself 10 minutes after you've eaten it to build back up to pace has been really helpful for just respecting the fact that my gut's doing a little bit more than just processing a gel. You know,
Yeah,
gel
for sure.
it can cope with really well, but
Yeah.
if you're going to put solid food in, which sometimes is needed, then you have to respect your body's going to divert some blood to your gut to manage that.
That's right.
And just be intuitive about that.
Yeah.
And in terms of troubleshooting, so for me, in that moment after I'd realised I had made a terrible mistake, I fortunately understood what I had done, and I also had enough experience to understand that I can come good and how to manage that. So I knew I just had to give myself 20 minutes to slow down
Your
and to
stomach
completely,
clear.
like no water, no food, just let everything settle before I built again. Would you agree with that? Like, is there anything you'd add to giving people advice for when they have put too much fuel in?
No, I think what you did, you know, sometimes it might take a little bit longer to clear. Sometimes it might only be 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's give yourself that chance. And try not to make that mistake where you overindulge, which is hard too, because there's a lot of good food that's on course. So in regards to what you eat, you know, whether it's exclusively just gels, which a lot of athletes can just do gels, or it might be a combination of gels and bars and then something, you know, as a treat or something just a bit different. But the most important thing is knowing what that number is, whether it's 150 calories an hour, whether it's 200 calories an hour, whether it's 230 calories an hour, whatever it might be, aim for that each hour.
Yes.
But then be mindful that the science behind it is that energy to volume ratio, thermic effect, and the low centering impact. So it's got to be things that cover those things, that cover those areas.
Yeah. And don't overcompensate.
Yeah.
Because I think often as well, for me, if my stomach's a bit funny and I miss a gel or I miss some fuel, what happened that day was I got behind in my calories because my heart rate was too high, I was nervous, I couldn't get my fuel in. And then I settled and I started to come good and I could feel my stomach opening up. And so I tried to put more in to catch up.
To try and make up,
Yeah,
You can't
and it's
make
like
up.
medication, you don't do that.
No.
And I think that's, especially for our new runners, it's good to understand that because nerves play a huge role in your capacity to get fuel in. And
Absolutely.
once you can get it in, just return to regular programming, essentially.
Yeah.
And we'll talk quickly about caffeine because it is something that you create 3 flavours of caffeinated gels.
Yeah.
They're a good hit of caffeine, but there's ways to do it to help you, and there's ways that can bring you a little bit unstitched if you do it wrong. So did you want to
For
talk
sure.
a bit about that?
Yeah, so we've put 80 milligrams of caffeine, and I did a lot of research on caffeine. And the thing is, everyone will have a different response. Some athletes will not have any response at all to caffeine, no matter how much you dose them up.
I feel so sad for them.
Yeah, so there's no effect at all. Then there's some athletes who get a mild effect. They're like, oh yeah, I can feel that, that's good. And then there's others who just completely flip out and they get a huge response from it. Now, the thing with caffeine is it doesn't actually give you extra energy. It alters the perception of how you feel.
Okay.
So those times where you start to feel like, why did I start this in the first place? I've still got 40 Ks to go. You know, all those negative thoughts start to creep in. That's when you start taking caffeine, just to help with that mental block that you might have. And as you say, you don't want to take it too early because you've set yourself a certain pace that you want to run. And when you're jacked up on caffeine, the likelihood is that you're going to run at a much higher pace than you've set yourself for. And what happens is you get to 60, 70 Ks and then it just all falls apart because you haven't measured your effort. You've run at an intensity way beyond what you should have to that point.
Absolutely.
So it's about measuring your effort, and caffeine can sometimes, it tricks you into thinking, I'm feeling way better, so I'm just going to go a bit faster here, And so that's why you don't want to take it too early. So it's the points of the race where you start to have that mental fatigue. Yeah.
And also, as it wears off, I guess just your perception of your experience returning to normal as opposed to slightly elevated. If you're somebody who experiences it in that way, can be psychologically difficult halfway through a race if you've started too soon and you're feeling great, and all that's happened is the caffeine's worn off and you've probably returned to a normal level of effort.
State, yeah.
But it actually just feels like a drop because you've had this slight false high.
Yep.
So I think for me, I use it in the back end, and also not everybody, but for some people, too much caffeine can upset your stomach, right? Like
Absolutely.
Some people have a really sensitive, particularly bowel to caffeine. So there's a good reason to protect your stomach from it to the end if you're going to have it. But also psychologically, when your body starts to fatigue, I think it's just like another little secret weapon that you can take to
absolutely.
save to the last minute. You know, some people will use all different things. They might have a favourite food, or if they're allowed music on course, it might be listening to some music. And I think for me, it's often just saving the caffeinated gel for the last 10, 15K to kind of, even if it had no physical effect, that psychological effect, that it's different, is really helpful.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of athletes have said that when they take caffeine, they feel less pain. So the pain they were feeling in their legs tends to go away.
Absolutely.
So, you know, there's things to, you know, whether it blocks that pain sensation. But, you know, it's a stimulant. So, but there's times to use it and times not to. So,
and again, that's something to be trialled in training.
Trial and training, see how your stomach tolerates it. See how you actually feel on it, whether it does give you that boost that some get. You may not need it, but then again, if you do and it works well for you, then that's a big advantage in that last, you know, section of the race.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the gels, and one thing that I'd like to talk about, because it's something that I really look forward to towards the end of a race, is, and lots of people will be using these as their nutrition strategy from the beginning, is the bars that you produce. So I myself primarily run on gels, and I do find after like 9 or 10 hours, and I start to get a hunger that I can't ignore, and so I'll have half a bar in place of a gel, because it's the same calories roughly for half a bar as it is to a gel. And it's been a real lifesaver for me many times, even psychologically, just to feel like I've eaten something after 10 hours of no solid food. So do you want to talk a little bit about why you developed the bars the way you did, and why they're useful as opposed to, you know, choosing to eat a Danish or something like that?
It's once again, it's about the stomach and choosing ingredients that are less likely to upset the stomach. So with this bar, it's dairy-free, gluten-free, it's vegan, so it covers a lot of areas that, you know, if people have, you know, food issues or food requirements, it covers that thing. But importantly, it's got a really nice texture. It's easy to eat, even at elevated heart rate, and it covers that low sensory impact that you're eating and you're not going, oh, you know, it's a good texture, good mouth feel, but importantly, very gentle on the stomach.
Yes.
And what we've done with this bar is that it has a slice down the middle, so it's 2 halves. So you're not having to break it off. It's a good amount that, you know, it's around 200 calories from a bar, but, you know, 100 calories that you can just get out of the packet and you can just chew on it. It's really, like I say, it's easy to get down.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for people who are potentially moving at a slightly slower pace, so the heart rate is a little bit lower, or that can mean that hunger kicks in. So I often won't feel hungry for so long because my heart rate's so high when I'm racing. But as I fatigue, I slow down and the hunger kicks in. So lots of people are managing that much earlier on in the race because they've got different goals. So would you recommend that alternating perhaps, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Or you know, and like I said before, there's no right or wrong. So it could be a combination of both. It could be just gels or just solids.
Sure.
And if you're going at a lower intensity, the more likely you're going to take those solid foods. But being mindful that, you know, not to have too much, but have enough that's going to get you to the finish line. So, yeah, with the bars, it's a personal preference on how you access those calories. But obviously the faster you go, the quicker you want that fuel. So, you know, gels is going to be probably the majority of your calories with a bit of solid food. And then sort of the runners that are going to be out there for a bit longer, it's probably going to be less gels, but a bit more sort of solid foods.
That's great advice.
So, yeah.
And just understanding the calories, just
Yeah.
reminding people to do that.
Exactly.
That a bar, if you were to take a bar thinking you're equating it to a gel,
Yeah,
you're going to get in trouble. So making sure you're aware that half a bar is roughly equal to a gel.
Yeah, spot on.
Well, I think that's covers off the products really well. I would really encourage our runners to get out there and try this product in the lead up to the race. We will be having these gels out on course.
Yep, gels and the tabs.
And the tabs, absolutely. So training with it will be a really good way for them to dial down their particular strategy, and remembering that if you do that in training, the chances of you needing to troubleshoot on race day will be greatly reduced.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, just know your numbers and prepare. Preparation is key to this event. It's,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thanks, Darryl.
Thank you.